Thank you for joining us for Ideas in Action with Gabrielle Burnham and Cali Fajardo-Anstine. I'm Joshua Carrera and project coordinator at Mayday Space, here to introduce tonight's event. We are partnering with One World to make virtual space for a conversation between these writers whose work is a tribute to language, to creating art, to the complexities and joys of place, communication, and location. At Mayday Space, we believe a radically more just and equitable New York City is possible. We're a multi-story organizing center here in New York City that is both a neighborhood resource, a citywide and global destination to amplify issues such as immigrant rights, food justice, tenant protections, as well as broader global issues such as climate justice and internet freedom. I am excited to announce that in addition to partnering with One World, today we are also launching the registration of our 6-week free class on race and revolution in the US with professor and scholar Dr. Johanna Fernandez, which you can learn more about on our social media page. Tonight, Gabby and Cali will be in conversation with One World senior editor Nicole Counts, who I will be passing the mic to. Nicole, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited for our latest Ideas in Action event with two of my favorite people in the whole world. So first up, we have Cali Fajardo-Anstine, who is the author of Sabrina and Karina, the National Book Award finalist, a finalist for the PEN Bingham Prize, the Story Prize, and was awarded the 2020 Reading the West Award in Fiction. Here she is. Hi. And next we have Gabrielle Burnham, the author of It Is What It Is Stone, her first novel. She's a dual citizen of the United States and Brazil, holds an MFA in creative writing, was a reporter, a creative writings teacher, and worked in immigration law. Hi, guys.
Hi.
I'm so happy to be talking to you. I also just realized I wish I wore blue so we could look like the Powerpuff Girls.
I know.
Should have coordinated.
I love it. It looks great.
I'm kind of the in-between of you two, which feels appropriate.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to be talking to you both, for a lot of reasons, but I think primarily because both of your fiction is so transformative for me personally, probably because it situates itself in realistic fiction, but also feels like it's transportive because it takes place in, places that I don't live in and didn't know as much about until I started working with you guys. So, first off, Gabby, you released your debut book in the middle of this quarantine, and Cali, you released your paperback during quarantine. So I'm just wondering, how has that process been during lockdown? How has your writing been? How are you guys?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, this was my first book, so I don't know any other way. I've just been doing Zoom events and living in the virtual space. In some ways, it's nice because at the end of an event, you can just go and decompress on your couch instantaneously, which is lovely. But I was just talking with my sister who just started law school last week, I think, and Emil, my partner, is also starting school, and they made the point that at the end of their class, they just shut their computer and then they're alone in a room. And that's the hard thing, I think, about doing these, missing those serendipitous moments with readers and with other panelists, because in some ways that's where the those fun and interesting moments happen, not really in the official event, but in those little conversations afterwards. So that's been hard, but something to look forward to with book 2 and 3 and 4 and the rest of the, one day we will get out of this. So
how about you?
That's so interesting. My little sister just started her second year of law school.
No way.
Yeah, like 2 weeks ago. Yeah.
Oh,
I didn't know that. That's super cool.
Look at that.
Yeah. So I debuted last year when I could be in person with people. So it is a big difference for me, but I also am somebody who's always sort of been comfortable in the digital space. I have a kind of like, I don't know how popular it was, but I had like a Denver MySpace when I was young, and I had like a really weird name. And so like, I always have been like pretty comfortable online, but I definitely miss being able to hug my readers and take pictures together. But I love our little Zoom pictures that we all take together now. And I think they're kind of neat. We should have like a scrapbook. But it's definitely, the way that we promote is different, and it's really important, I think, to always be thinking about other writers too, and like if you have a platform, sharing work, because this space is just so different than it was even last year.
I feel like, you know, one of the reasons that, well, at One World, when we're kind of like every month we think about what ideas in action event should we do, who should we partner together, and I actually think because of quarantine, I thought about you two together. I think one of the things that's nice is that I'm always someone who I think likes talking to my authors and tries to really often, but I feel like I've been on the phone lately with a lot of authors, which has led to more conversations about everything, not just like the actual edits, you know what I mean? And both of you, who I know really well, have expressed to me these kind of you know, remarkable or otherworldly moments in your writing where like you've either written something and then you called a family member and it actually ended up happening in your family, or you started, you know, doing research and you unearthed the photo of a character that you've already written. So it's interesting because I think you both have tapped in, I don't want to call it supernatural, but you've tapped into some sort of like familial space. And I just wanted to hear you guys talk about that.
I can go because I just sent Nicole a picture like 2 days ago. I was like, oh my God, I know it's Sunday. Pay attention to me. I found another picture. I think for me, it happens more and more frequently. And I think it's just because I've been writing longer. And sometimes those connections are embedded in your psyche in a way that you're not really aware of. So I'm thinking of times recently as I'm working on revisions of my forthcoming novel. I was talking to my godmother, she's in her 80s, and I was talking about her grandmother, who would be my great grandmother. So I did not meet her, but I described a scene that I had envisioned that I'm working on, and my godmother was like, yeah, that happened. Yeah, we used to wait outside, and like this man would come visit her, and I was like, what do you mean it happened? She's like, yeah, what you're describing is real. And so those kinds of things happen all the time. I'd be curious, Gabby, I want to hear about like how it works for you. Does it ever come in dreams or anything like that? Or like, where do these occurrences show up? I'm just so curious.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm not someone who like really believes in magic or like the supernatural. I'm not super woo or anything like that, but I have had experiences in my writing where I've written something and in speaking with my mother found out that it's actually something that happened with our family, or even just writing a sentiment down that like later I've gone back and connected it to something else, even if it's not that specific. And so I want to know why does that happen? How does that happen? You know? And so I've been thinking, and in thinking about this event too, I've just been thinking about like what it is that I love about fiction. And I think fiction, you know, draws on things that we know about the world to be factually true. It draws on history, and it is kind of like a continuation of a conversation about what the world is. But then it also draws on our present experience as humans and personal experience too, like the way that I move about the world. But then the thing about fiction is that it also has the imagination tied in. So in that way, it's the future, it's another world. It's something that's outside of the past and the present. So it's fiction connects past, present, and future in this really incredible way. And it's, you know, one writer, one person channeling that. So it's a really powerful force in that sense, in the way that other mediums aren't necessarily. Not to like, I mean, I love all different kind of poetry and nonfiction, different types of art, but I think fiction has that specifically. But I've also been thinking a lot about, and this is something that Dr. Mona, I think, brought up in your One World event with her and Ibram Kendi, is this like burgeoning field in science called epigenetics, which is the concept that like environmental factors actually alter your DNA. Things like stress, pollution, like the environment, but I think also preference, pleasure, love. So when you think about that, the fact that like, you know, historically speaking, your great, great, great grandmother experienced something, then perhaps changed her DNA and perhaps was literally passed down to you through, you know, your cells cellularly. I mean, that's kind of what we're conjuring when we create fiction.
Like on that, like something that I think you both do, this is more woo-woo than maybe like you would say, Gabby, but I feel like, you know, I've talked to each of you about generational trauma and generational kind of just like knowledge and history. And I think I do believe it gets trapped within ourselves when those truths aren't spoken. And I mean, you know, Cali, this is something like we talked so much about with Sabrina and Karina, but I think we talk about it kind of in a deeper level with the novel that you're writing, where like you almost have to say it just so it can be out there so the next generation is no longer holding it. And, you know, Gabby, you had a very physical reaction to writing the book, like a very painful reaction. And I feel like it's partly because you were expelling parts of, you know, the history that no one had ever been asked to expel before.
Yeah, that's so true. That's the, I mean, that's the beautiful thing, and also the burden of stopping the line of intergenerational trauma.
Right.
But
what do you guys think is kind of the hardest part of writing that kind of work? Like really like kind of writing that work, but also delving into the history, like family history or whatever, like what has been, I guess, some of the, you know, hurdles to that?
I'll say that when I was younger, the main hurdle was feeling that I had permission to be able to write about those things, because they were things that I wasn't sure that we were allowed to talk about outside of the family and even outside of my own mind. You know, some things you don't feel comfortable sharing, that you have these thoughts or you have these feelings with other people because you don't want to be judged, you don't want to be seen as damaged, you don't want to be seen as a traumatized person. So I think in the early stages of my writing, just allowing myself permission to write about what haunted me most and what scared me most. But yeah, it's really been about just being able to have ownership and then writing about certain events with compassion and empathy for those who experience them in addition to myself, especially if I didn't even experience them, if they happened to an ancestor of mine. So just thinking of like ethical ways to deal with memory has been a question for me.
I like that, like thinking of ethical ways of dealing with memory, you know, like taking the ethical into every single part of our work. So I'm curious to hear more about both of you, you know, your research and how you integrate that into fiction, you know, like how you literally sit in archives, Cali, or go back to Brazil and visit family, Gabby, and then take those experiences and write them into your fiction.
Yeah, I think research with fiction is interesting because I think part of the research is like an internal investigation. And you know, what you were just saying, Cali, about like having permission to write about these things. Part of it is that like, you might be like with me, I was like figuring out my own, you know, sense of self or like my relationship with what I was writing about. And you kind of have to like go into that knowing that part of the work is like sorting through, you know, yourself through writing. So that's some of the research with fiction. But then, yeah, I think like the fun of it too is just like being able to go to Brazil because I'm writing about Brazil, like seeing my family and reconnecting with them, or just, you know, being like, I'm bringing a lot of like nature writing right now because I want to write more about the natural world. And that's the joy of research for fiction too, is that you get to choose something that you really love because you want to put it in your book and like somehow build this imagined world with these things that you're learning about, or IRL world, you know.
I read this Q&A with you, Gabby, and you talked about when you went to Brazil, and I think you said you like drank and you danced and you swam and then you wrote everything down. And I was like, oh, do you do it like immediately that night, or do you have like a special notebook? Like, I was so curious about your methodology of a gathering.
I write with, I have moleskins, and I like take a lot of pleasure in figuring out what color I'm gonna do next. And yeah, I handwrite everything. And it might be like immediately, like sometimes you have to write something down instant. It's like you cannot move if you don't get it out and put it down immediately, I think. I saw you posted something, they were like, I have a short story inside me and I have to run home and write it right now. And I know that feeling. But yeah, I think I also don't pressure myself to do that. I think sometimes it's nice to like let experiences sort of simmer inside you, and then they come up in writing in these really unexpected ways. That to me in some ways is the hardest part of writing fiction, is that you have to be willing to kind of like let yourself go in it a bit, and not try to like control every part of it. There are parts of it that are really in control and that you can hang on to, and then there are other aspects of it that it's just you're allowing yourself to meander in a space that's a little like hazy and dark, but it will clarify eventually.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel that, like in terms of my research. I know Nicole mentioned that I like hang out in archives. Well, I can't do that anymore.
Archives, graveyard.
I feel like really like that is one of the things I miss most, are being able to go to the library and use the private rooms to write, and also going to research in person. But I have found a new form of research that I really like. I wrote a new story yesterday, and I went to the building where this historical event happened in the 90s that I had read about. And I didn't really have an agenda. I just kind of wanted to feel the mood of that space and that structure. And so I'm sure I freaked all the guards out in the building, because I was like walking around like all in white. That's like the new thing I do for some weird reason. I used to only wear black, and now I wear only white. And I had like a manila envelope, so I looked really creepy. And I was just like walking back and forth until I was like, oh, they think I'm doing something strange. And then I left. But after I left, I kind of like, I sat down and I just sort of like pushed out the atmosphere of what I felt in the building onto the prose. So my relationship with research it's pretty wedded to my work at this point. And I don't know if it'll change, if some days I'll pull back from it, but right now I really love it. It helps your imagination. Like it's just like it's like bumpers at the bowling alley. It's like more to guide you. It's really nice.
It's funny that you don't know why you're wearing all white, where I feel like you wore all black when you were like also deep into the rewriting of Sabrina and Karina, which I feel like a lot of that book happens by night, like under the moon, versus Woman of Light. I mean, it's literally called Woman of Light. It's so like startling bright, the way that you learn of these characters and stuff.
Interesting.
You're an editor thinking.
My white clothes phase. We should. Yeah.
I think you both are right, though. I think that fiction, what it can teach you versus maybe any other writing, is it can teach you to let go of control. I mean, I think that's one of the big life lessons that we all learn in our own ways. But I think fiction writers, they get a sense of the necessity of meandering, the necessity of wandering to understand yourself, you know? So, you know, I don't know if I've actually ever asked either of you this directly, but, you know, you both write about place in very beautiful and vivid ways. And you both know that I love, you know, any kind of place-based writing, but I'm wondering if you ever got any, you know, pushback about the places that you write about, or if anyone ever told you, you know, no one's going to care about Denver, or no one's going to care about This American in Sao Paulo, you know?
Yeah, I think the struggle for me, I honestly didn't really care if anyone was like, no one's going to read about Brazil, because I just knew that's what I needed to write. But I think that what I was nervous about is that the stakes felt so high, because my entire family's from there, but I didn't grow up there. You know, I grew up in the United States. So, you know, I really felt like I need to get this right, because I'm the first I'm the first person in my family who's not from Brazil in that same way. So the stakes were high for me, and that I want to make sure that I'm accurately representing the energy that I feel when I'm there, and that the energy that I feel is an experience that other people feel there, and it's not just me as a visitor experiencing that. And also just like little things like, what if I get a road wrong and everyone in Brazil is going to point it out, stuff like that, those kinds of anxieties. But, I think place is really important to my novel. And it's been really nice to see how people really feel connected to Sao Paulo when they read it. That's honestly been the most incredible feedback that I've gotten on my book, is that people have really connected with the descriptions of Sao Paulo. So,
well, I couldn't tell if anything was wrong. So because I'm not from there, so I was like, oh, everything's right. Everything's in its right place. For me, I'm still I'm shocked even now when I'm working on new work. I'm still surprised that I get to write about Denver and people care. It's really ingrained in me, this insecurity that I had growing up here, that we weren't in any movies, we weren't in any TV shows, we weren't in any novels, barely. There were, very few. And if we were, they were not about people like me. So it was really hard to imagine that. So I still, in the back of my head while I'm working, sometimes I'm like, who's going to care about Denver? And I have to really push through that, because to care about one place is to care about all places. If you look at the place deeply enough, it's sort of like the individual of a person. That individuality is universal. And so the deeper you go into a place, the more you could connect to other places, I think. But it has been a pleasure to bring Denver to the world. I'm really curious now that the book has been translated into Japanese. I'm really curious how readers there will respond to Denver. So it's exciting.
Oh, I love hearing you talk about that. I also agree. If you understand one place, some of my favorite books are not actually about the place I grew up in, and yet I feel like I understand it in a different way. It's interesting that you just brought up your Japanese translation, because one of my favorite books is Territory of Light, which takes place in Japan, and I feel like I know that character in that place as well as I know the place that I grew up. So one of my favorite things about both of your writing, and I actually think something that a lot of readers bring up for both of you, is the way you write women. Specifically that, you're not trying to write women that are any kind of boring stereotype or, are predictable in any kind of ways. And so I want to know how each of you approach, maybe any characters you create, but specifically when you're in scenes maybe where it would be easy or natural to kind of defer to some sort of stereotype or whatever it is. And how you guys challenge yourselves.
Do you want to go, Cali?
I don't have an answer yet, but if you have one on the tip of your tongue.
Well, I think that, writing, I'm learning more and more that I am interested in writing characters that are contradictory by nature, that, and I think that that's just the way that I approach fiction in general, and the fiction that I love. I love fiction that asks complicated questions and doesn't worry about finding an answer to them. And so I love characters that do that hold opposing realities, because that's what human beings do. Human beings are deeply contradictory, and that statement even in and of itself is a cliche, but it's true. I mean, we can be two things at once. And I think with Linda, she's an uncomfortable character to sit with at times, because of that fact in her personality, that she is someone who's individually traumatized, but is also privileged, that she cares for people, but also betrays them, that she loves Marta, but it's terrible to her at times. So yeah, I'm really kind of interested in characters, whether they're women or not, although I am, I think, predominantly interested in women and relationships between women, but I'm just interested in that in general. So I think that that's why it comes out, in my characters.
That's so interesting. Have you gotten the question yet? Why do you write about women? Have you gotten that like from interviewers?
No.
Okay.
Have you?
I get it all the time. I know they love it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do you write about women? I'm like, oh, I'm interested in writing about women. Now that you say that, Gabby, about you know, sort of the idiosyncratic nature of who you're drawn to, I think about when I was growing up, I didn't really ever feel like I was like a belonger. I always felt like an outsider in most every space that I was in. Like even in the familial space, I felt like a black sheep. They might disagree. They might be like, we liked her, but I don't know about that. But I do, I do feel like orienting yourself as an outsider allows you to kind of see that nature in other people too, and accept them and embrace them for that. And a lot of my characters really are sort of, they're on the fringes, they're rebellious, they're not like the most beloved person of the family. They're sort of out in the distance. And then I think when I run into, if I ever have a character that falls into stereotype, I have wonderful readers. I have my wonderful editor, Nicole, and they're usually they're characters that are on the periphery. So they're not like the main character. It'll just be like somebody in line at the bank, and somebody will be like, hey, you're falling into shorthand here. And I'm like, oh, I'm being a lazy writer. And so I think it has to do with too, like being a strong writer and using all of your skills all the time, even for the characters who aren't main stage. Like even if they're just sort of off in the cafe shadows in the back, they still need to be a full human being there and not just like a prop that's just sitting around.
Right. Yeah. So that for the people in the back.
And I think in your character, sorry to interrupt, but like you know, I so feel that in your characters, Cali, that you're representing characters who feel on the fringe. But what's amazing about that is that I think in a lot of ways, like what's normative is a myth, and that actually this is true for many people. The way that your characters you know, pass through life is the way most people, I think, pass through life. But because stories that appear to be more normative are always told, then everyone's feeling like this is what I'm supposed to be, but I'm never meeting that. And I think fiction and telling more stories that are actually a better representation of what life actually is like for most people in the world will make people say, wait a second, that's actually how I felt at that time in my life, or that actually was my experience.
Yeah, definitely.
I totally agree. I mean, I think to your point of normative, Gabby, something I've been thinking about a lot is like how the old guard of Hollywood used to say things like, you know, no one wants to see the truth. Like we want to see things that we aspire to, whatever, or however that they wanted to like rephrase what they were doing. But I think the truth is we do want, the most powerful things are the things where we can see ourselves, because then we can also see ourselves getting out of something, or we can see ourselves moving forward, you know? And we see ourselves as worthy enough to tell a story about, which is, you know, something that I think that a lot of media doesn't think that way, you know? It kind of brings me like a little bit of what you were saying, Gabby, about your characters and, you know, some of the power structures you guys write. And I'm wondering how, even when some of the writing feels uncomfortable, maybe between two characters, like if there's a fight, or one character is being mean to another character, or one character is obviously more powerful in some way, whether it's two women, whether it's a man and a woman, how do you handle writing those things, you know, that feel kind of hard to, you know, hold?
Well, it's almost the opposite for me when I feel like a scene or a conversation between characters feels too tied up or too easy. I push myself towards it. What's actually a different direction it could go in. I actively try to work out, because I mean, and this relates completely to your point of like old Hollywood wanting to keep these like aspirational stories uplift. I mean, this is still true today in Hollywood. It's still true today in publishing that, you know, there's a archetype of a story that needs to be told, and it's built in all of us. So when I write a scene where it feels very normal or expected, or I know that I'm writing something that's been told to me over and over again. And so I have to push myself towards like, actually what would happen? And that feeling is so uncomfortable because it's like the thing that I've been told over and over again, or like the way I've imagined this conversation would go, is, you know, it's so ingrained in me that having to break from that is a very uncomfortable feeling for a writer. And I think for a reader too, the experience of reading it, something that's a little like, wait, this kind of just like jarred my whole understanding of how this is supposed to go. But actually that's closer to the way things actually are, right? You know?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm more comfortable with this
agree.
I think.
Some of my earlier work, I noticed that my characters would get like to the point where they're about to like fight each other. Like they're yelling at each other, they're getting there, and then they'd be like, the doorbell rang, and then they go and answer the door, and it's all the tension's gone. And I would do it over and over and over again. And it's because I did not want to go in there. Like I was like, I don't want to deal with this if they get involved in this. But as I grew as a writer, I allowed them to go there. And time again, they surprised me. Sometimes somebody was a bigger person. You know, things really started happening that were like sparky, like when I would actually allow them to live their lives outside of like my tyranny, me trying to control my characters like little puppets. But I do think it's interesting when you go to these sort of darker spaces. I remember the first time I, you know, essentially killed off a character. The scene didn't make it into the story. It was Any Further West. I actually wrote a scene where the mother character overdosed, which it's alluded to in the beginning of the story, but I took out that scene. I was upset for days. Like I cried afterward. I was like, I can't believe I'm a monster. I like killed this woman. Like, what am I doing? You know? And it made me just feel like the fiction was going off in a place that I no longer controlled so much. And that's when I knew my work was going in like just a bigger direction than it had gone before, because I was just sort of allowing my characters to have their own individuality, and usually as individuals we can do kind of bad things to each other sometimes.
Oh, I love that. So this leads me to my next question, and then we can go into some of the audience Q&A. So everyone, if you have questions, please put it in the Q&A. You know, something that you, Cali, wrote on social media that I've been thinking about kind of nonstop since you wrote it is that, you know, it's our duty as writers, editors, whatever, to share the knowledge that we have when it comes to craft and to make craft more accessible, you know? So it's not just that you have to get your MFA or that you have to, you know, work under certain people to learn, you know, the craft of writing. So I'm curious, what are some of the most, you know, either memorable teachings you guys have ever had, or the thing that you keep coming back to over and over again when it comes to craft and writing?
I can go. So I did an Instagram workshop recently, and it cut off like right when I gave this like little bit of wisdom, and people were like messaging me and they're like, can you re-record? And I was like, never. No, I didn't say that. But now I'm going to tell everybody what I got cut off before and I didn't get to say. I took a travel writing nonfiction course, or just some course for my English major requirements at Metro State, with a professor named Dr. Doe. And Dr. Doe is very eccentric, and she would like stand on chairs and she would just like shout and recite poetry. And she would play Sam Cooke while we did free writes. And I thought she was like the most like wild thing. I loved her. I still love her, she's around. But she made us take note of how often we were using the five senses in our work. We actually had to go through and like draw little symbols, like when we would use touch or taste or smell, sight. And that showed me that I was using smell a ton, which I still do, and I actually have to pull back from. But it showed me I was lacking in things like touch and sound. And I really started to try to push to like elevate those. So I think this is my bit of wisdom for today. If you keep track of how often you're using sensory detail in your work, you can kind of manipulate it and then manipulate the reality of the work. But the first job is to figure out how you're using it and if you want to enhance it at all.
That's a good one, for sure. I have two small ones. The first is write for 15 minutes every day. I think that was some of the best advice I was ever given, because one thing that writers are really good at is not writing. And like with everything else, like if you want to be a basketball player, you got to get on the court probably every day. If you want to be a ballerina, you have to train every day. If you want to play piano, you have to train every day. Writing is that. And 15 minutes is a really good goal, because even if you have 6 kids, as Marie Ponceau, the poet, did, she wrote for 15 minutes every day. And you can write a whole novel that way. So, you know, even if it's just like when you're waiting at the dentist, pull out your pen and write for 15 minutes. Everyone can do it. And, you know, and it's free too. You just need a bank pen and an envelope. And then the other thing is lower your expectations. That was the second best piece of advice I ever got. I think that a lot of people stop writing because what comes out the first, second, third time isn't as good as they want it to be. And that's just like the nature of writing. First drafts are just, you just are getting everything out, knowing that a lot of it is not going to stay, that a lot of it isn't good. And the difference between someone who writes and a writer is the revision process. Like you revise a ton, and that's really when the writing starts for me. So write for 15 minutes every day and lower your expectations. That's the best craft advice I ever got.
Oh, I like both of these a lot. It does happen a lot in revision. I think sometimes the things I ask you guys to do in revision is a little crazy, and I am always surprised that you guys listen to me.
I mean, we could have we should do a part 2 where we just talk about what editing with Nicole was like.
I thought we were going to talk about that.
We should talk about it, because it's true though. Like, I thought I had a book done, and then Nicole Counts read it, and I was like, oh shit, this is like not a book yet at all. And you know, I really like had to dig in, but that is also like the best part of it in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. That's when you're like really getting something. And that's why writing like is such a solitary thing. And then you get to work with someone like Nicole, and you're like, wow, someone else is like putting energy towards this thing that I have. What's better than that? I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah, I definitely agree about the energy being put towards your work. There have been times like you've read something for me, Nicole, and like days later you'll text me and you're like, I just had an epiphany about what you meant. And I was like, oh my God, I didn't know I meant what I meant, and you saw it. And that's just so helpful. And just to have, you know, we talked about lowering our expectations. That was one of the things I was really prepared for, is to have really low expectations of an editor. I mean, they prepared me. They said that I don't know, the literature world, I was told like, no one edits, nothing's gonna happen once you turn it in, and that's not true. That's not true with Nicole Counts.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, Nicole, like, what is it like when you get a piece of work and like you can see that there are, I mean, these like fantastical elements that need to be developed, like these intangible things in fiction that need to be developed. Like, how are you so good at like targeting exactly what needs to happen? That's not just like this sentence needs to change, or like this needs to be reorganized, but the more kind of like, you know, the intangibleness of fiction.
You guys are being way too nice to me. Maybe, you know, Chris, our publisher at One World, he told me once that I feel like I say a lot to writers when I'm editing them, which is take it to the body. And I think I think the same way while I'm editing, where as I'm reading, I think about how my body is experiencing the work and whether I'm getting excited or whether I'm getting, you know, angry. And I am learning more and more about myself that I have a lot of pent up anger that I think is my like generational. I don't think it's generational trauma for me. I think it's generational anger. And I think when I start to get angry with a work, like that it's not working in a certain way, that's always the part that I feel like then I need to have a conversation with the author about, you know? But it's really like trusting your vision, you know? I feel like that's why I try to spend a lot of time just getting to know you and your work and what you guys want to do and what you want to accomplish versus like what I want the book to do. Because it's always, I mean, the most like the reason I do what I do, I really have realized is because when the revision comes in and then I see what you guys have done, I'm like, holy shit. It's like, not at all what I would have done, and is so much better. It's so good. You know, it's like, it's so exciting. I mean, Cali just did this actually, where one of the main characters in her work, she wrote years ago this backstory, and she was like, oh, I'm just going to send this to you so you like get to know his character better. And like, I have not stopped thinking about the scene of this woman in the bathtub in this kind of like home that's kind of this like white person making a museum of like native arts, because that's what people do, you know? And I just think when I get so excited like that, and when I can't stop thinking about it, I know that that's the direction we need to go in, you know?
I love.
Go in? No, I was kidding. It's to be in the novel now.
Oh, it's so good. I want to make sure that we get to some of these attendee questions. So I guess I'll go to the first one, which is, when you write about trauma and it leaves you feeling heavy, what do you do to take care of yourself?
Such a good question. Honestly,
I really both take a lot of baths.
Yeah. I like talk too much about how like I know I will have made it when I have one of those like bowl baths. You know what I mean? That's all I want. I was in a lot of pain, like literal physical pain, while writing parts of my book. It's funny that you say like take it to the body, because I think that when I know writing is working in some ways because I start having really physical reactions to it. Not to go back to like the epigenetics thing, but I think that there's something cellular that happens when you start like really targeting something that is in you. And that can be pleasure and like really just like being like, oh my God, this is so good. Or it can be extreme pain. So I started going to acupuncture every week. I did a lot of stuff to kind of just take care of my body. It's also just, you know, talking to Nicole, talking to your friends. You know, it's solitary, so connecting with people helps me too.
Yeah. I also am a big bath fan. So that bowl you speak of, I'm like, oh, I have a fund for it, and I need to get the house first, and then put it out. I take a lot of walks. I'm a big walker. And those help me just like think things through. And they also help me transition between projects and things that I'm doing. So if I'm doing like promo stuff all day and then I need to have a space clear up so I can do that heavy work at night, the walk kind of cleanses that mental space for me. I like, my family might not agree, but I do like seeing them. So just being around them and laughing and, you know, hearing stories and seeing all the babies and things like that, that also serves as like a cleansing palette. It's like, oh, this is my people. This is where I come from. Okay, back to being alone at the desk. And then one of the biggest ways that I feel like I take care of myself is getting back to the land. So either going up into the mountains that are nearby Denver, or going down to Southern Colorado into like my ancestral homelands. That kind of serves as like, it really feels like it recharges me on this like deep, deep level that I mean, I write about it all the time. So you probably know how I feel about the land, but it just having that base is really important to me. And it does help me feel like I have purpose and that it's not all doom and gloom when I'm working on these things.
The next one is, for both authors, have you ever had what seemed like a brilliant idea for characters that fizzled out?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The answer is definitely yes with that one.
Well, this is, you know, but that's okay though. So if you have a character that fizzled out, I would keep it and put it away somewhere, because I recently found a story from 2010, like in my old emails. And I took that character and I repurposed her into a new short story. So she still existed within me. I just hadn't found her right story yet, but now I have it. But it took 10 years.
Mm-hmm. I feel like Gabby, your main character in your book, like you had ideas for her and then you had to try different avenues of personalities before you hit the right one that felt right.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, the revision process for Linda's personality was like multiple drafts. And it's just like, and part of that is like learning how to write in some ways, not like literally, but like, you know, learning how to write a novel. Like you have to just like write things out in a very expansive way before you know if it works or not. At least some characters. What I'm working on now, I'm like so much more organized and have such a better, like clear sense, but I'm also writing in the third person. So it's different when you're like in a first person perspective, like in someone's head. You kind of have to just like work things out, I think, and then see what you need to trim back, what you need to change. And,
yeah. Gabby, this one is for you. Great writing tips. Is It Is Wood, It Is Stone the first novel manuscript you ever wrote, or do you have an unpublished manuscript before this?
Yes, I do. No one will ever see it.
Why, please?
No, it's not something that I want to publish. You know, for me, like, I would say the third piece of advice I have for writing is that, like, it is so important to, like, figure out, like, what is your unique voice? And that, like, I don't totally understand, like, what that means, but for me, that is, like, figuring out what do you, like, care about? Like, what is it that interests you? Like, what can you write for, like, an entire book that you're just going to be so addicted to that you want to keep going back to it? And Brazil was that for me. But I have a book where I was, like, writing about this, like, slubby guy in, like, New York City. It was, like, the first person of this, like, guy that I hated. And every time I would go back to write it, I was like, I hate this character. Like, why am I doing this? But it's because I was writing a story that I'd heard many times before. I thought that, like, writing from, like, the perspective of a man was gonna be, like, super subversive and interesting. It wasn't. So, you know, I wrote a whole book about that. I was like, nope.
That's like the other writing advice is like, for me, I can immediately tell when someone is writing for themselves versus writing for, like, some sort of larger purpose or for their readers. And I think that's a big deal. You know, I think when you're writing and you're controlling every single scene, every single character, you're not writing a book that should be shared widely. You're writing something where you're learning how to write, which has its own importance, of course, you know, but I think when the story starts coming through you, when you've, like, as I always say, like, clear yourself out kind of enough mentally, like how Cali says she goes on walks or you go up to nature. I feel the exact same way. And then the story, you know, it's coming through you. It's not really that you're dictating it.
Yeah. And also, like, I didn't know that you could, like, absolutely love writing. I didn't know that. I had to, you know, write some, like, I was like, this has to be painful because those are the stories I've been told about writers. And then when I started writing stuff where I'm like,
I'm drunk and like,
yeah, like, you have to be wasted in order to get through a draft.
Yeah.
And now I'm just like, I am, you know, writing is my booze, man. I just love it.
Writing is my booze. I love that.
Cali, this one is for you. Great to know you're writing a novel. What is it about, and do you have a plan for its structure before you begin writing?
Yeah. So I started this novel before I started Sabrina and Karina, but I didn't have the skills. So we were talking about, like, where do you learn how to write? Well, I did that in the short story form, which I know some short story practitioners would be mad at me for saying that I use that form as sort of a learning place, but I did, but then I fell in love with it. But Woman of Light is about my ancestors' migration from southern Colorado to Denver in the 1920s, and it spans the 1890s to the 1930s in southern Colorado and in Denver. It's a love story. It's a story that looks at racial injustice in the city, and it also looks at what it means as a woman to carry on and work when you don't have men around to do that in that time period. So yeah, I had a structure because I went through so many iterations of that book. So I wrote it from first person in the beginning, and then I pulled back, and then I did third person, and I had false starts that went on for 120 pages. And eventually my literary agent, she was like, you need to come up with a plan. Like, you need to actually plot this book. So I have a very strict structure that I followed, but now that I'm revising, I'm seeing you can bend that structure. But yeah, I had a structure, and now I'm kind of veering off from it a little bit.
I think also for this novel more than, I mean, at least I saw in Sabrina and Karina, because it's so historical and we're trying to hit certain marks, like you'll outline out even a part just to see how it's going to work within history, you know? So it's not like a strict one. It's just, oh yeah, this actually happened at this year. So we have to put it towards the beginning, you know?
Yeah, like I was looking up like certain things that happened in Roosevelt's presidency the other day, so I could like, oh, okay, well that's what would be on the radio. So time is actually one of the structures, which it always is, but it
third
really,
person. I was curious.
What'd you say?
Is it first person or third person?
It's third.
Yeah.
And I don't think there are sections that are first. No, it's all third now, which is, I came to third person late. I did not start writing out in third person. That was a later development.
I just find it's easier to be structured with third person. First person is like really tough to structure, I think.
Yeah, because of the consciousness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a few more that I would just love to get to. So this is for Gabby, but you know, this could also be for Cali. What is your favorite thing about your sister, who the book is dedicated to? This is a question from your sister, so I had to ask it.
Oh my God, my favorite.
We're all sisters people, so I felt like I had to, you know, share some sister.
I love it. My favorite thing about my sister is she is has been a dedicated housing organizer in the South Bronx, and she is so fearless. Like she takes slumlords to court, and now she's going to be a lawyer. So they should really watch out. We have so much fun together. She recaps like Real Housewives with me, and you know.
Oh, that's cute. I can't ask Cali the same thing just because Cali has so many sisters. So I don't want you to get in trouble with who you're picking to talk about.
Who's your favorite sister, Cali?
Yeah, right.
You're breaking my family. Just kidding.
Okay, so the last question is, how do you prefer to write? Laptop, pen, pencil? And I would just add on to that question, do you know, is it different when you write short stories versus when you're writing like thoughts for the novel versus do either of you ever write poetry?
I write by hand when I'm visualizing a scene. And this is something that I developed over time. So before I write a scene, I take a notebook and I write down long form. I write down everything that I'm visualizing, and I do sort of a mental walkthrough, and then I go to the computer and I type the prose with the keyboard. But yeah, I don't really have like a preference on the difference between short story and novel writing, anything like that. And it's actually something I've been thinking about a lot lately. When I write, I'm writing. And so the form always sort of just shifts around, but it feels like it's pulling from the same muscle for me.
Yeah. I'm the same. I handwrite everything first. Poetry, nonfiction, novel. I don't write like an entire novel by hand and then put it in the computer, but for me, like doing things by hand, again, like getting in the body, it's like you actually have like a physical connection. And I really do think that it's different than being for drafting, being at a computer that creates some distance. But it's also like for an editing process for me, like I write by hand and it sort of makes it less precious. Like there's something about it being on the computer where you're like, this needs to be like final when it's coming out. And writing by hand, you can kind of like sketch and draw lines and like whatever. And then when it goes into the computer, it's the first round of a kind of like a light edit for me.
I think that's important. I think when I'm talking to writers sometimes, especially when you get caught up in a scene, and this doesn't matter if it's fiction, nonfiction, or poetry. I'm working with someone right now who's writing like humorous essays. And I tell people a lot, like at some point, I think you have to actually step away from the computer when you're kind of struggling with certain things and just go back to like the purpose of why you're writing this. And I think that is easier longhand, you know, or whatever. If you're blocked, I think that's a good struggle, or a good way to, you know, figure out that struggle is to do it by hand. Okay, that is all the time we have, but thank you both so much for joining me. This has been awesome.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, everybody who watched us.
I think Gabby froze Amaya. Maybe, did she on you?
She's frozen.
Okay, we're gonna just wave. Bye.